The man awoke, startled from his dream. His body was covered in sweat. He could hear pounding in his ears and feel his muscles ache with tension. His eyes darted across the room. His friends were still sleeping off the beer, snoring loudly as the cool light of a new dawn shone through a crack in the door. He suddenly felt terribly alone. An unbearable burden of uncertain terror weighed him down. His lips quivered, and his voice cracked as he shouted, "Wake up! Something terrible is going to happen to me!" The man's name was Enkidu, and he was worried he was about to fall sick and die. His story is contained in a series of clay tablets written over 3,000 years ago. The original tale may be beyond 4,000 years old. In the 8th clay tablet, resting in the strange marks of a Babylonian stylus, is a story of intense anxiety. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of a hero king called Gilgamesh and his strange best friend, Enkidu. The tale is set in the ancient Near East. Enkidu is a wild man who lives a nomadic life in the hills east of the great cities in the plains. He runs freely with the gazelle, living hand to mouth, acting on instinct. Eventually, he is tamed and civilized by a beautiful woman and comes to the city of Uruk, where he meets Gilgamesh. The two go on many great adventures together, and whenever Gilgamesh is worried or confused, his friend Enkidu is there to help and reassure him. Enkidu's insight saves them from monsters and tricksters. But in Tablet 8, the roles are reversed. Enkidu seems to be betrayed by his instinct and intuition. He becomes a quivering wreck, dreaming about a conference between the gods. At the meeting, it's decided Enkidu will fall sick and die. Gilgamesh now tries to be the comforter. "Let's pray to the gods," he suggests. But Enkidu is paralyzed by anxiety. "Why are your lips buzzing like flies?" asks Gilgamesh. "Why do tears pour down your cheeks like the great canals of Uruk?" Enkidu thinks he can already feel the start of his illness. He refuses to leave his bed. He tells Gilgamesh he regrets he ever left his life, free from disease and anxiety, in the hills with the wild animals. Tragically, his instinct is right. He does fall sick and die, leaving Gilgamesh consumed with worry about his own mortality. Anxiety, the anticipation of future danger, is not unique to Homo sapiens. Even bacteria sense danger and swim away from it. The origins of a lot of anxiety-like behavior may be found in the common ancestor of reptiles and mammals. Tortoises sometimes express anxiety in new situations. Mice exhibit more or less anxiety-like behaviors depending on the attention they receive from their parents. In baboons, anxiety levels are often associated with position in the social hierarchy, helping defeated males to de-escalate and accept their secondary role in the group. Before our human ancestors started to settle in cities 10,000 years ago, it's likely they experienced their fair share of anxiety. Ferocious wild animals, being rejected by the tribe, possible attack by other humans. There were a lot of things to be anxious about. Anxiety could help a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer prepare for fight or flight. But as humans started to settle in permanent locations, relying on agriculture and religion to sustain larger populations, there was suddenly a whole host of new things to be worried about. The human brain can comfortably maintain stable relationships with about 150 people. But the city of Catalhoyuk had over 10,000 residents. How do you prevent social rejection when you live with 60 times more people than your brain can manage. Larger cities were also vulnerable to disease, some of them spread by newly domesticated animals. Traders from other settlements might bring a new strain or sickness. We know that maintaining a civilization with modern technology during a pandemic is difficult. In an early city, dependent on communal agriculture, pandemics were a terrifying danger that were hard to predict and seemed impossible to prevent. Sickness, as Enkidu told his friend Gilgamesh, seemed to depend on the fickle will of the gods. The Mbenjeli Bayaka are a hunter-gatherer group from the Northern Democratic Republic of Congo. They are an egalitarian social group who are present-focused. Participants in a study were offered 1 stock cube today or the promise of 5 stock cubes tomorrow. In the Mbenjeli tribe living deep in the forest, 90% of hunter-gatherers chose to have the guarantee of 1 stock cube today. In a farming town outside the forest, less than 40% of farmers chose the 1 stock cube. The mindset of an agriculturalist is quite different to that of a hunter-gatherer. Farmers are used to planning months or even years in advance, sometimes with great success. A lucky and skilled farmer can become much richer than his neighbors. At the same time, he lives with a higher degree of background anxiety than someone living hand-to-mouth. Animals may eat his crops. Someone might steal them. There could be a blight. The weather may be too hot or too cold, too wet or too dry. When our ancestors began farming and living in cities, they had to adopt the future-focused mindset of an anxious agriculturalist. Religion played an important role in this transition. A cult could be used to justify long-term, future-focused investment, for example in the construction of a site like Göbekli Tepe, normalizing the mindset needed by a farmer. Religious practices could also help with intangible anxiety. An anxious farmer could assuage his worries with a sacrifice or ritual, putting to rest his fears about environmental factors he interpreted as the will of impulsive and unpredictable gods. The tale of Enkidu's collapse into anxiety, his lament for a simpler, present-focused life outside the city, is a famous moment in the greatest epic story of the ancient Near East. The urban scribes who wrote the story out on clay tablets knew the bargain their ancestors had struck in changing their way of life so dramatically. But in the story, no solution is offered. Gilgamesh's prayers to the gods are in vain. Enkidu dies, but now Gilgamesh is consumed with grief and worry about his own death. His quest to become immortal fails, and he returns to the city of Uruk. The story ends with a description of the great clay battlements and temples of Uruk. Perhaps in these immense human achievements, there is a solution to Gilgamesh's quest, a kind of immortality that frees him from his death anxiety. But weren't these the walls his friend Enkidu cursed in his fevered despair? In about 500 BC, wandering through the rural farming communities of the North Indian River Plain, an outsider religious teacher offered an alternative to the Vedic hierarchies and rituals of the day. The Buddha encouraged people to set themselves free from dukkha, a word translated as unease or suffering. This dukkha, the Buddha taught, was the result of clinging to things which will pass away. Partners and children, male and female servants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, elephants and cattle, gold and money. If the Buddha had read the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, he would surely have taught the solution to Gilgamesh's anxiety over his friend's death was for Gilgamesh to let go of his attachment to his friend. In the earliest Pali Buddhist texts, we find fragments of the Buddha's life story. Whilst still a young man in his prime, he became consumed with worry about the prospect of falling sick and becoming old and frail. He decided to leave his home in search of spiritual enlightenment, something eternal and incorruptible which would not pass away. But it was this future-focused mindset which eventually led him to emphasize the value of being in the present moment, letting go of anxieties and worries and placing them in the perspective of the eternal cosmic order. In later versions of the Buddha's awakening, the story takes on the qualities of a fairy tale, the king who wishes his son to experience no anxiety at all, the prince who accidentally sees a sick old man and is so anxious he will become like that, he runs away from the palace. Anxiety is still a problem, but the setting obscures something important. The early Buddhist religious communities did not flourish in palaces and kingdoms. They found a home amongst rural farmers in the fertile river plains of northern India. The Buddha understood that for a farmer, a future-focused mindset could be a benefit, but it could also become unbearable. 100 years after the death of the Buddha, another outsider, the dark-skinned Zeno of Citium, started discussing philosophy in the public centre of Athens. He and his followers were called the Stoics, and they argued knowing you are doing the right thing, following your values, allows a person to be calm and contented, even if life is unfair and difficult. Although Zeno's writings have not survived, the teachings of other Stoics have. In the dialogues of Epictetus' definition of a true Stoic, a man who is sick and yet happy, in peril and yet happy, dying and yet happy, in exile and happy, in disgrace and happy. These are all states we would normally connect with anxiety. On the death of his daughter, the Roman Stoic Cicero retreated to his villa, where he wrote a series of books about grief and pain. One book he dedicated to passions, where he discussed the irrational thoughts and feelings of the mind. He described how a healthy caution of danger could easily become grovelling dejection and fear. Thinking about his own experience, he wrote that anxiety was grief with deep thought. But these irrational thoughts and feelings could be mastered because they came from judgments and opinions actively made by the mind. Stoic writers recommended strategies to calm the mind. A bit like the Buddha, Cicero suggested putting things into perspective, remembering the immensity and wonder of the universe and how small our worries are in comparison to it. Other writers, like Seneca, emphasized the value of focusing on the present. If a man combines all times into the present moment, he makes his life longer. Today in the West, a lot of us are familiar with the teachings of the Buddha as part of mindfulness practices. Not as many people know that the legacy of the Stoics is also with us. The creators of cognitive behavioral therapy were directly inspired by Stoicism. CBT is a talking therapy that aims to reduce symptoms of mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. If you had to pick one idea to characterize medieval Europe, hell would be a good choice. Medieval churches were covered in scenes depicting the final judgment of God and the burning fires of hell. The invention of purgatory, a middle place for okay people to wait around and be purified, provided some release from the intense religious anxiety. But the threat of hell could not be easily escaped. If hell was so horrible, so anxiety-inducing, why was it so popular? It was a source of power for the Catholic Church. People could be threatened or scared by the idea. It was also an outlet for sadistic fantasy. Could people use the idea of hell to escape from their day-to-day anxieties? Probably. But even for the most devout Christians, the terrors of hell were an inescapable background anxiety every time they entered a church, covered in murals of demons cooking sinners in cauldrons. The purpose of the anxiety produced by hell was to drive medieval Christians to good works and a holy life, to saints' shrines and the compassionate relief offered by the Church to those who confess their sins. The right kind of future-focused anxiety was good for people because it would save them from eternal damnation. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the author is taken on a journey through the circles of hell, then purgatory, and finally heaven. Dante is a bit lost in life. The vision is sent by his crush, Beatrice, to help him make sure he doesn't end up in hell. Beatrice is now in heaven and worried about her friend. At the end of the story, she tells Dante he is stifling his anxiety, covering it up and pretending everything is okay. She wants him to embrace it, to be anxious and in fear of hell, so that he will live a holy life. Let your anxious thoughts breathe freely forth, she tells him. This all seems very serious, but there's another solution to anxiety in medieval literature: laughter. As the Black Death spread through Europe, no one was safe. The terrible symptoms, the boils and swelling, seemed like something out of a hellish fantasy. But even the Church was helpless. Priests died horribly like everyone else. Was this the judgment of God? Perhaps, but for some it seemed more like the absurdity of life. As the bubonic plague spread through Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote a story called The Decameron, about 10 people stuck in a room together, hoping to escape death by social isolation. To pass the time, they tell stories to each other each day, but these are not urgent calls to repentance or regret of an unholy life. They are absurd, dirty, funny stories. In one story, the wicked Master Chiapelletto tricks a priest with a fake confession before he dies. Because of the fake confession, after his death, the evil man is made a saint. In another tale, a non-Christian is convinced by his Christian friend to visit Rome. When the man sees the sinful behavior of the priests, he immediately converts to Christianity. In a third tale, 3 brothers squander their inheritance. Their nephew is taken in by a kindly abbot, who turns out to be the daughter of the King of England in disguise. The 2 marry, and the 3 uncles are given even more money to waste. In these stories, shared by strangers during a medieval bubonic lockdown, we see the triumph of laughter over anxiety. In 1621, Robert Burton wrote a book called The Anatomy of Melancholy. In it, he described the disease of melancholy, which means something quite different to what it means today. Melancholy was characterized by mental instability and derangement. Both the physical body and mind were out of order. Today we might describe it as a combination of extreme depression and anxiety. To Robert Burton, melancholy was caused by too much black bile in the body. He was influenced by ancient Greek and Roman medicine, which believed 4 humors, or fluids, needed to be in balance. But the Anatomy of Melancholy was also a personal self-help book. I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy, he wrote. Despite his old-fashioned ideas about how the body worked, Burton's practical advice was based on personal experience. He suggested laughter and staying active, new experiences and activities which make us amazed and excited can help keep melancholy at bay. Ancient Greek and Roman doctors had recognized some people seemed to suffer from more anxiety than others. In the writings of Hippocrates, a Greek physician, a man terrified by the sound of a flute is described as sick with anxiety. But by the 18th century, feelings and emotions were being medicalized and categorized in a new, more intense way. The French doctor Boisier de Sauvage made a list of 2,400 illnesses, including a long list of what he described as mental disorders. These mental illnesses could be broken down into 4 more categories, in a category called morositates. He listed nostalgia, longing for the past, tarantism, an excessive desire to dance, hydrophobia, fear of water, and panophobia, irrational panic or terror. Whilst in the past people could be more or less anxious, anxiety was a spectrum of behavior and feelings, now people were either sick or not sick. The categories were black and white, and seemed to be backed by the new science. The ancient Greek idea of a body with 4 humors that needed to be in balance was rejected. Anxiety was located in the human nervous system of freshly dissected bodies. The language of this idea has stayed with us. We often talk of someone getting on our nerves, seeming nervous or feeling tense. In the 19th century, the attention moved back to the mind and the new and exciting idea of the subconscious. The anxiety-inducing idea that we did not really understand or control our own minds gave birth to new terms and categories. Pierre Janet suggested the term psychasthenia, which, he argued, was anxious feelings triggered by subconscious ideas. Sigmund Freud preferred the term anxiety neurosis, a kind of free-floating general anxiety that came out of our subconscious. These developments in approaches to anxiety did not happen in a historic vacuum. From Boisier de Sauvage to Sigmund Freud, a massive transformation in human culture and society occurred. It was as significant as the move from hunter-gatherer to agriculturalist 10,000 years ago. We call this change today the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution saw the transition from hand production methods to machines. New chemical manufacturing and iron production processes. The introduction of steam power and machine tools. the rise of the mechanized factory system, and there was an unprecedented rise in population. At the same time, whole villages disappeared, and new ones emerged. Ecosystems were destroyed. Old family and community life collapsed, and society was dominated by a new focus on consumption and purchasing power. Research conducted in former coal mining regions has shown that populations in these areas have a 33% higher chance of neuroticism. This trait is usually associated with depression and anxiety. Although these areas suffer from higher unemployment today, the researchers argued the origins of these traits could be found in the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. We know that even in modern industrialized societies, children spend less time with their carer, less time being held, more time alone than in pre-industrial, agricultural, and hunter-gatherer societies. In later life, a lack of early childhood care may lead to increased anxiety. It's no coincidence that as more people experienced more prolonged anxiety in newly industrialized societies, psychoanalysts and doctors began to categorize and medicalize their feelings and emotions. In the 20th century, advances in technology created new kinds of anticipatory anxiety in war. Shell shock was the term given to anxiety-stricken soldiers in the First World War. In the Second World War, entire cities were subjected to this in the bombing campaigns carried out by the Allies and the Axis. After the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Japan in 1945, a new, terrible anticipatory anxiety consumed the world. The prospect of a thermonuclear war. The threat of nuclear war meant that no one was safe, not even in their own home. The 1964 movie, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is a black comedy film that imagines a scenario in which a destructive nuclear war is started. An unhinged US general goes mad and orders a nuclear strike on Soviet Russia. The American government desperately tries to recall the bombers but fails. One gets through and completes the mission. The film ends as the US government starts planning to move into a deep underground mine and restart civilization. The film director Stanley Kubrick started writing the movie as a serious Cold War thriller, but as he read about the horrific outcomes of nuclear war, he was struck by the absurdity of the whole thing. I found that in trying to put meat on the bones and to imagine the scenes fully, one had to keep leaving out things which were either absurd or paradoxical in order to keep it from being funny, he reflected. Kubrick embraced the instinctive desire to laugh in the face of crushing Cold War anxiety. New threats to the body were accompanied by new threats to the mind. In a confusing, fast-moving and complex world full of strange new technologies, simple ways of seeing, explaining, and believing things were attractive. The rise of fascism in Germany showed how easily people could be led into allowing terrible things to happen. Like a disease, this threat was intangible and contagious. We call it ideology. In the 1954 movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, alien plants land on Earth, but their invasion is unconventional. Rather than attacking cities and destroying infrastructure, they quietly grow clones of the people they encounter, perfect copies of humans which will eventually replace the real people. But it's not their bodies that have been stolen, it's their minds. The film has been interpreted as a metaphor for American fears about the spread of communism. It's terrifying and anxiety-inducing to think your friends and neighbors might suddenly be seduced by an idea which turns them into strangers. In the 21st century, we can see this anxiety and fears over radicalization online, worries over what is and isn't fake news, and the growth of global conspiracy theories. The cult Canadian comedy film Kids in the Hall, Brain Candy follows the story of a weak-willed scientist working in the basement of a massive American pharmaceutical company. Under pressure from his boss, he sanctions the use of a new drug, Gilgamesh, which makes it feel like it's 75 degrees in your head all the time. Gilgamesh makes people happy and relaxed, and of course has some terrible side effects no one is made aware of. The film satirizes neoliberal capitalist approaches to mental health. Not all mental health medication is destructive. Advances have saved and transformed people's lives, but the dangers of overprescription and addiction are real, especially in for-profit healthcare systems like in the United States. Over-medication sometimes becomes a capitalist stopgap solution to the problems and anxieties created by capitalism. Research done by Tim Kasser, an American psychologist, has shown that people who believe happiness comes from accumulating things and having a superior status are more likely to have symptoms of anxiety and depression. There are plenty of reasons to feel anxious in our globalized consumer society. Above and beyond all this, hanging over us all is the prospect of a climate apocalypse. There are consequences to our industrialization. Global warming poses a risk to all life on Earth, and our actions now are making it worse. This kind of long-term, future-focused, anxious thinking is not as foreign to humans as we might think. In the medieval period, the prospect of the final apocalypse and judgment of God was often on people's minds. Anxiety about it was considered healthy because people's day-to-day choices made a difference to their destination. Remember Beatrice telling Dante in the Divine Comedy, "Let your anxiety breathe forth freely." It's hard to find a way to assuage this gnawing anxiety, but perhaps this anxiety we feel now will help limit the challenges our descendants face. Our industrial revolution has made possible digital revolution. Instant messaging and social media have given us instant information to assuage our anxieties, simultaneously creating new ones we hadn't even thought of. AI, like modernized mechanized factories, offers to free us from the burden of work. But in a capitalist system where we value most highly productivity in ourselves and others, what does this mean for our own self-worth? And if a program can imitate my productivity, what does it really mean to be human anyway? Advances in transportation and communication have made our world smaller, but our anxieties have somehow become bigger and more insurmountable. Many of these leave us as individuals feeling more helpless than a first-generation Neolithic farmer worrying about his crops. Thinking back to the agricultural revolution, it took the Buddha and Stoics over 1,000 years to respond to the anxieties encapsulated in Enkidu's dream. We are less than 300 years on from the start of the Industrial Revolution. As we adapt to the changes in our world, our children or their descendants may begin to distill our experiences into guidance and advice. Now that's the kind of future-focused mindset I can get behind. I was a little anxious making this video, wondering if anyone would be interested in it. Please give it a like and subscribe if you'd like more content like this. I wish you a calm and peaceful day.